Okay, we've come up to just a little over 12, so I'm going to open the webinar today. We're absolutely delighted to be hosting the first of 3 live webinars from our Human Forward series today, which is called Future Ready Your Organization, Business and HR Strategies to Thrive in Uncertainty. Across this series of webinars, we're going to be introducing a series of very unique keynote speakers as we all focus on really how best to succeed in today and tomorrow's world, just from a business and personal perspective as we live amidst the pandemic. Just in terms of a couple of housekeeping points before we get into introductions. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of these points which you can see on screen. We really want to encourage interactivity and a sharing of ideas, so please do use the chat function and do post questions as we move through, and we'll do our best to come to those questions, but also Matt and I are going to be on the line at the end of the session, so for anyone that doesn't want to ask a question in the group session, we will be online for a little bit afterwards, and we'd be happy to carry on that conversation. We have muted individuals just to take out any background noise, but do post your thoughts, ideas as well, and any other bits of information that you feel the group would find of use. We've scheduled out an hour today, as I said, but we're going to be remaining online afterwards, and we will be posting our details at the end of the session, and also we are recording this session as well, so you will be able to get a copy of that following the discussion today. So just in terms of some introductions first, very excited to be joined by Matt O'Neill today, and we will be talking to this subject, both of us, and really looking at how we build business and HR strategies to really address rapid change and also unforeseen circumstances. We'll be touching on some of the economic and social trends impacting work on the near and long-term future, and really also providing some food for thought in terms of what the future might hold, and with that in mind, how we can really recharge business and talent strategies to be even more future ready. Let's start with a couple of introductions. My name is Mel Small. I'm part of the Randstad RiseSmart UK team, and I support a lot of organisations and individuals with career and mobility, talent mobility solutions. I've got about 25 years experience in career and organisational transition and transformation, people development and consulting, really passionate about helping people to shape engaging cultures and really drive business and personal agility, really helping firms to create these positive environments and futures despite the environment in which we're in, and also just to help individuals to create career pathways that they absolutely love on a day-to-day basis. Matt is joining me today. Matt is a futurist. I'm sure a role that absolutely fascinates certainly me, and I'm sure a lot of us on the line today. Matt really assesses and highlights trends that are changing society and is an essential contributor to what it will be, what it means to be successful in the future, rather. Matt's really passionate about helping organisations to bring about positive change and really helping people to understand future trends and then find ways of applying them as well as the technology to address organisational challenges. Behind the scenes, there are a number of my colleagues today, making sure we stay on track, we respond to questions, and also ensuring probably that I don't break WebEx as we go along. So just in terms of a couple of introductions, for those of you that don't know us, we are Randstad RiseSmart, the talent mobility arm of Randstad, who are the global provider of HR and flexible work services. We really help create future forward workforces that really can thrive in a lot of uncertainty. So helping our clients, some of whom will obviously be on the webinar today, so welcome, to align the career aspirations, skills and knowledge of employees with the needs of businesses at whatever an employee's whatever stage of the life cycle they're actually on. We really decided to run this webinar because many of our clients are asking us to be, how they can be even more prepared for the future, be more more agile, be more resilient, really strengthen their brands, build fluid cultures, and really navigate the change that's ahead so that they can transform and mobilize and retain talent. We also conduct a lot of research behind the scenes, so we're going to be sharing and highlighting some of that research today and talking through that. So in terms of the webinar, we're all trying to build cultures of talent mobility. It's so critical, obviously, making sure it becomes part of the employee experience. It helps to drive individual and organizational agility and engagement overall. Many of the organizations we talk to are looking at how they address skill gaps, really just to be even more future ready. And many of us and many organizations are still struggling to fill those skill gaps. So they're looking really inside to develop homegrown talent across the organization, whilst also thinking about, upskilling to fill possible gaps. I think McKinsey, the research that they've done, they've quoted as saying by 2030, as many as 375 million workers, or approximately 14% of the global workforce, may need to switch occupational categories as digitization, automation and advances in AI disrupt the world of work. So the kinds of skills that companies need are going to shift. That's going to have profound implications in terms of the career paths that individuals wish to pursue. And I know that Matt's going to be talking about some of those future skills that are going to be needed today. Just in terms of some of the talent research, we have conducted a talent trends report where we surveyed about 200 employers around the world in Q3 of 2020. Some of the key trends that came out were as follows, which you can see on the screen here. We'd be really happy to share some of this research afterwards, so please do follow up with us. It's a really interesting report. Companies around the world face even more uncertainty than ever. I'm sure many of you on the line will have read Josh Bersin's reports around the coronavirus crisis being almost a big reset, requiring new ways of thinking about work, about life, and about business and about leadership. So a lot of our research that we conducted brought some really key insights into remote working, employee engagement, technology adoption, the demand for digital skills, and so on and so forth. So please do get in touch with us afterwards if you'd like a copy of some of this. Just in terms of the pandemic, obviously, that we're in, I'm just sort of framing this in terms of before we go on to talk about the future and living amidst the pandemic. Clearly it's had a huge kind of psychological and financial toll on talent within companies. Some of the negative impacts of the pandemic on talent are as follows here. So you can see they include a reduction in employee compensation, furloughed workers, layoffs, permanently closed facilities. I know that a lot of us will be moving through that in terms of organisations. I think added to this, another piece of research that we did in the UK has revealed that HR professionals, talent professionals and leaders are set for something like 22 days worth of overtime in the second half of this year as redundancy figures increase and workloads skyrocket amid the crisis. So, the difference, I guess, between organizations that have thrived, versus others are perhaps agile execution, which again is one of the reasons that we're putting on the webinar today. And I think, apart from this, outlook, the Talent Trends Survey also finds that, 70% of employers are very optimistic about the business outlook as well. And they're really looking at how they empower their workforce and employees as well. So again, we're happy to share some of that research with you. So organizations, the workforce needs to be agile. Perseverance is perhaps key. A couple more stats here for you to look at. 31% also said, I think last year, that if the economy was to worsen, they would be completely prepared. So again, we just wanted to share this. Agility is likely to be one of the most important skills, and it's about how you can deploy talent in terms of the environment and help people to seek out opportunities internally. So again, just a couple more stats that you may be all interested in. And then before I transition to Matt, really just wanted to share again some more statistics. So as you look at these today, perhaps consider, is your organizational response strong enough to drive performance? How well are you defining next steps? How are you redefining work and your employer brand during the pandemic? How are you managing the talent experience? How has digital transformation and some of the new technologies that are out there how are they adding value during the pandemic? So at this juncture, I'm going to hand over to Matt O'Neill to dive into the future. I'm not going to ask him to predict it completely, but to dive into it from a human and technology perspective. Thanks, Matt.
We are sharing audio. 1 second. Yes, I'm on. Okay, good. Right. Okay, so thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today. This image here, I think, is kind of a pretty good image of what I think the future of work is going to look like over the next 10 to 20 years. It's really, I think, about humans becoming more comfortable working alongside machines, but these machines are going to work alongside us in increasingly sophisticated ways. First of all, I'd just like to say a big thank you to Randstad RiseSmart for commissioning me today. 10% of the fee that they're paying me is going to a charity called My Mental Health Rocks, and they work with school children, I think, to show them that their mental health is something that's completely innate, as is creativity, as is leadership. And they're really, really ahead of the curve, and I just wish them all the best, and I think it's wonderful. We're going to look a little bit about what these guys are looking at with children moving forward. So the sorts of projects that I've worked on, well, we all remember what life was like before lockdown. Used to be quite good fun, it used to enable lots of travel and meeting people, but life is much more like this nowadays. So spent over video calls and sometimes even virtual reality as well. So pretty wide ranging. I also run a business called ModComms. We're a small team who do, I would say, very innovative, creative and internal communications projects, which are often informed by the work that I do as a futurist. So today what we're going to look at is what sort of changes might we expect as we move forward to this economic new normal that is so often touted? How might the physical workplace change? And I think we've got someone from Cushman & Wakefield on this call, so be interested to hear from them because they were real proponents of the 6-foot office at the beginning of lockdown. How is virtual working changing? And look at some of those technologies that will inform that. And I think that leadership itself is set to change, in part because of this move towards virtual working, but also I think we have new types of employees and staff that we're going to be managing, especially with the growth of contingent labor. Penultimately, well, I wouldn't be a futurist if I didn't look at artificial intelligence and automation, a bit about what it is, what it's not. I can promise you it doesn't look anything like the Terminator. And finally, to explore what does future readying ourselves mean as we move forward over the next 5 to 10 to 20 years or so. So thinking about what that means to arrive at this economic new normal. So this is my 5-step program, so to speak. I don't think that we are going to thrive in the traditional Darwinian sense of survival of the fittest. As Mel alluded to earlier, we're very much into, I think, the era of the survival of the most agile. So over the next 2 to 3 years, while we know what our perceptions of pre-lockdown life was like, but when we realized that that's what we were going to be facing, we very quickly entered a response phase, which of course was the largest homeworking experiment in human history. I did a quick search of Google Trends and I found that the search for force majeure, act of God, went through the roof at the beginning of lockdown. So no doubt our insurance company friends will be panicking immensely. Clearly, can we get the slides larger? I'm going to try. I don't know if it'll work. Does that make any difference? I'm just expanding them a bit, but
yeah, Matt, it's a little bit bigger. I just wondered if you could get them any larger on the screen.
okay, let me try. Is that making a difference?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. They're not very text heavy, the rest of them, so hopefully it won't be such an issue. And of course, you know, the operational crisis we found ourselves in, well, that accelerated digital transformation, certainly as far as communication technologies, and that's what a lot of us would have experienced. And I think a positive upside was, of course, we saw more agile innovation, and I'm going to give you some examples of that as we move forward. Unfortunately, well, you know, we only have to look at the Office for National Statistics here in the UK to show that 2 consecutive quarters of GDP dip mean we are in a recession. What will we see? Clearly, there's going to be more mergers and acquisitions, more consolidation. Our insurance company friends who were probably panicking if they were looking at Google Trends will certainly be panicking now. Unfortunately, more bankruptcies and closures, and yes, that's going to have a ripple effect through the rest of the economy. So you probably wouldn't want to be supplying kitchen equipment to restaurants at the moment, as a case in point. But of course we will, and I think some companies are, organizations are, in this regeneration phase. Clearly there is more investment into these narrow artificial intelligence technologies. So I'm referring to, in our homes, our smart speakers, or if we've got an Apple iPhone or a Google, we can speak to these technologies. Some of you are probably already working with them in the workplace, and that's finding itself felt. I think clearly we will see more business-to-business marketplaces. So we're quite familiar in the B2C sense by looking at, say, eBay and Amazon. But if we look towards China, we see Alibaba as a wonderful example of B2B marketplaces. And I think that we can expect a lot more of this in Europe and the US purely to aid resilience. I suspect manufacturers, they already are starting to bring manufacturing back from the Far East, sometimes referred to as near or onshoring. Again, this is all about increasing resilience in supply chains. And I think some of our more forward-thinking procurement people will be thinking, can we morph our supply chains into something more like supply networks? And a lovely example of this would be back in Japan in 2011. We had a situation where General Motors, during the Tohoku earthquake, were pulling in engine parts purely from Japan. And of course, because of what was happening, that was causing serious delays. Apple had diversified their chain, so they were pulling in semiconductors from South Korea and Japan. So I think clearly we're going to see more of this supply network taking place. But as we enter this idea of the new normal, I suspect our organizations will be leaner, unfortunately. And that is really down to the fact that there is more investment into these narrow artificial intelligence technologies that will start to automate more of our tasks. I won't say jobs, I'm just going to say tasks for the time being, because I think the hallmark for human beings is to work out how to push themselves up the value chain, and we'll be looking at that a little bit later. Hybrid working seems to be obvious. I think clearly people are recognizing, especially those of us who were in offices, are recognizing the benefits of working from home. But I don't think that working in offices or going back to workplace is disappearing in a hurry. Clearly there will be, I think, fewer employees needed for the same roles. There will be some technological unemployment, that displacement of human beings by these automation technologies. And I think that we're now starting to see a lot of governments take this idea of universal basic income a lot more seriously, this idea of giving citizens an equal amount of money regardless of income. I think possibly the furlough structure, the subsidy, is going to affect it, but I think we are probably going to enter some sort of welfare New Deal situation moving forward. And clearly an aspect of being agile is to thrive by seeking out new digital partnerships, and we're going to look at that a little bit later. And also, in terms of efficiency, can we find service sharing? So a lovely example from the public sector, I think, was Richmond and Westminster Council, who for a few years at least were sharing a communications function. So these are some of the stages, I think, that we might expect as we enter this economic new normal. Now, many of us will be familiar with this idea of VUCA. This goes back to the 1990s. It was an old US military colonel, I think, and he described VUCA as being the operating environment in which soldiers would find themselves. And that found its way into business nomenclature and has become a mainstay of many business schools. In fact, you'd only have to log into LinkedIn, you'd probably find half a dozen articles. But I would like to say, can we flip the VUCA? Can we make it something that is positive, a positive way of looking at the world as we move forward? So sometimes this is referred to as flipped VUCA, and it stands for, first of all, velocity. That's our ability to enact change quickly in response to shifting circumstances. And a lovely example in the UK would be the NHS, who were able to get the Nightingale's hospitals off the ground, in some cases in as little as 9 days. And that's an interesting example of what happens when we let go of our day-to-day thinking, I'd argue. The second, I'd argue, is unorthodoxy. So just being really curious and ready to approach challenges in unusual ways. And I think the most unusual one that I saw through lockdown, and I absolutely love this, it was the Sunmarie dating agency in Japan. And, they realized that with all the social distancing taking place, it was going to be difficult to do matchmaking. So what they did was they introduced matchmaking in car parks. Now, would it work in the UK and Europe? That's questionable, I'm not sure. But I think it was a lovely example of just taking an unorthodox approach in order to push your business forward. And then instead of complexity, I think the key thing is collaboration. So in order to thrive in the digital world, that really comes from sharing our knowledge and forging new relationships. And I think that the pandemic will accelerate the rise of these digital services where companies start to offer the best of what they're good at and start to offer these more sort of joined together Meccano-like services. And a lovely example, I think, of collaboration is if we look at Alibaba in China. So they're quite different, I think, to Amazon as a case in point. So Amazon, they want to have an ecosystem where people can play in it, but they also want to participate in that ecosystem. So in effect, they are competing with some of the sellers who choose to use the platform. Alibaba are not the same. They are saying, right, we will be the ecosystem and we won't compete with people. And this was a really great example of enabling collaboration between designers and manufacturers to create PPE gear very, very quickly as the lockdown ensued. And finally, I know, we hear so much about agility. So my definition of agility might be a little different to others. I see this as broadly our capacity to drop away one mindset in favor of another and just to take a much more fluid approach to life. And I think a lovely example here would be Boston Dynamics with their Spot robot. This was back in New York when we were creating the emergency hospitals. They actually got their code base onto GitHub, which is a programming repository, and they made it possible for people basically to program these robots that could be used to treat COVID patients and to assess COVID patients. So new VUCA is one to look out for. If you're interested, you're very welcome to get the slides from Randstad RiseSmart a little later. So I think we do have someone from Cushman & Wakefield on the call, and this image, I've pinched this, I think, from your website. This was your design of this idea of the 6-foot office, this idea of the socially distanced office, and it made a lovely little interstitial before we go into the next section. So as we return to the office, which I think all of us are hoping will be the case at some point, at least in part, I think we're going to see some changes. So here is a fictional business. This is Acme Corp. Anybody who remembers the Roadrunner, you might remember that Wile E. Coyote used to source his explosives, his TNT, from Acme Corp in order to try and hunt down the Roadrunner. So anyway, this is a fictional business. It doesn't exist. I think we'll see a number of different aspects of office life changing. The first being the temperature camera. Now, I can tell you from personal experience that this works. I can remember a time a few years ago, I had a job in Manila, and then I was traveling back up to Hong Kong, crossed over the land border to Shenzhen. I was pulled aside because I had had a flush. It turned out I had dengue fever. This was after a blood test. So a bit of a surprise, but nonetheless, I can tell you from personal experience, these things work. Lifts, well, clearly we're going to have some form of reduced occupancy. I think contactless services, so in this case, it could be a door, could be a voice-activated blind. I suspect we're going to see more of these contactless or voice-driven services. In receptions, now this might be more of a Chinese thing, but it remains to be seen. I call this reception scanning, and that's because in China, we see from the company Rocket One, that's ROKIT1, they've come out with augmented reality glasses that use facial recognition to identify a person and then to tell the person wearing those glasses something about that individual. So it could include, the name, department, a temperature assessment, and possibly there's even talk about this idea of viral immunity, though we still have a way to go there. Hybrid meetings. So, this won't be unusual to us. I think some of us were possibly even doing this before the pandemic, having face-to-face meetings, but bringing in colleagues. I think we will bring in colleagues over video screens, but what we'll see later is that I think we'll have more sophisticated collaboration technology, which will be a real game changer. But of course, we will be thinking about how can we keep the virus at bay. So ultraviolet light baths, I would argue. Now, will it look like a strip light? Probably not. I suspect it'll look something more like your Roomba vacuum cleaner patrolling the halls and keeping everything disinfected. So, but clearly, I think these are the sorts of technologies we can expect to go forward. Security guards with AR temperature glasses, again, that remains to be seen. I think there's a cultural aspect to this. What's quite interesting is that I think desk spaces, because of hot desking, over the last 15 years or up to 2019, we're actually getting smaller. But I think what we can expect going forward is desks, getting larger, and if there is hot desking, obviously we're going to have more of that distancing. And there's plenty of data, I think, out there that is arguing that bring your own device will become something entirely standard because people won't necessarily want to share equipment in the same way. Employee tracking, this is a very contentious one, but if we've got any Swedish colleagues on the line, you might be familiar last year with lots of talk of people wanting to have chips inserted into their arms. So I think that the Trades Union Congress, which is a major UK trades union, they're already looking at this and they're already working out some of the ethical challenges around this, and will employees accept it? But as with all jobs and all businesses, they are created because society has problems. So I'm arguing that we might start to expect the growth of a new job, the hygiene expert. Now, will this person be employed by your organization? Hard to tell, but I can certainly imagine consultancies opening up and having these hygiene experts prowling your hallways to make sure everyone and everything is compliant. But I think forward-thinking firms now are looking towards semiconductor fabrication. So in semiconductor fabrication, you have to have extremely clean environment. So now we're seeing forward-thinking firms saying, can we take advantage of these clean room air handlers, which are effectively, very sophisticated air conditioning units? So I'm not saying they're all coming to all of our workplaces. I just think that we should be aware that these things are being discussed and in some cases being implemented. So that's having gone to our physical workplace. Let's have a bit of a thought about how remote working itself is likely to change. So I think this is about 5 years ago. Some of you might remember the story of Programmer Bob. Now, Programmer Bob worked for a large IT systems company, and up until the point that he was fired, he'd actually won an award for being the most productive programmer in the entire division. And he was fired because, let's say, another well-known technical company was brought in to monitor what his typical workday was all about. So he'd come in and he would surf for Reddit. He'd take a nice leisurely 1.5 hours lunch, hit up eBay, LinkedIn. 4:30 arrives and it's that all-important end of day update email to management. So what happened is that Bob had taken 25% of his salary and just outsourced his entire job. Now, what this highlights to me is that contingent labor is not only being used by organizations, it's also being used by perhaps maybe a little bit misguided intrapreneurial types. And I know that this is something that Randstad RiseSmart are very hot on, not contravening policies, I might add, but intrapreneurship, which I think is a key skill going forward. So, was Bob a model intrapreneur, or was he guilty of leeching intellectual property and breaking all kinds of information security protocols? But nonetheless, contingent labor in the interest of resilience is clearly on the up. And I know at least 3 people who are working for large organizations who are outsourcing aspects of their job in order to increase their productivity. So I think strategy and planning are also changing as well. They will change because of the introduction, the acceleration of increasingly sophisticated collaboration technologies. So if I take the creative paradigm here, this would have been something when I was part of a much larger agency we would have done on a regular basis, receiving our brief, using post-it notes. We would have been full-time teams, perhaps with the odd freelancer, but the technical production ultimately carried out by human beings. But I think moving forward, what we're starting to see is this emerging paradigm. So, not full-time teams, multi-location teams, and these teams are increasingly contingent. They're increasingly gig-based workers. So here, what we're seeing is the planning is shifting. We've got Debbie and Paul. They're joining us via holographic projection in this case, and we're seeing huge strides in San Francisco and South Korea with that technology at the moment. Lucy, subject to the geopolitics, is joining us from China over video link, and we've got a couple of nameless people here who are joining through virtual reality. So I think more sophisticated collaboration technologies coming together and combining. But the key difference as well is that we're going to see more of this AI-assisted production. And I'm going to give you an example of what AI-assisted production looks like as we move through the presentation. Now, one I think that's really worth focusing on is if AI is the foundational technology for the 21st century, then spatial computing, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality will be the way in which human beings experience it. So I think that what we're starting to see is VR emerging, and I think it's accelerating because people are just getting sometimes a little bit tired of video calls, and VR offers new possibilities. What we're seeing now is new platforms emerging that are, I would say, at the similar stage to where the social media platforms were back in about 2005 to 7. They're just finding their feet, they're just finding their presence. And here's an example from Finland, a very well polished system called Glue. I think it's an excellent collaboration platform, and I suspect it's going to go far in VR. Just below that, from San Francisco, we've got ScienceBase, and they're trying to address social learning. They're also trying to address some of the mental health challenges that people are facing. So 2 examples of platforms. Think of these perhaps like, I don't know, Facebook and Twitter, for example, 15 years ago. Just platforms that are finding their feet. I think it's going to be big. So PwC, even before lockdown, were forecasting an exponential growth from 2019 global industry value of $30.5 billion up to $450.5 billion by 2030. I wouldn't be surprised if that pushes even further. Some of the applications, while we're seeing things like data visualization, that's even including things like finance now, who are using these platforms in order to sometimes restructure supply chains in real time. Product and software design, engineering is a huge one. And some of you may have already been accosted by charity collectors on the high street who are now carrying virtual reality goggles. So we're starting to see the hardware system emerge. We're starting to see the software system emerge. If I was going to make a forecast based on how I see these technologies all developing separately but converging, within about the next 15 years, I think we will see something approximating a Star Trek holodeck. And that will, by the way, include a sense of smell as well as a sense of touch. It's really, really moving quickly. So this was a little switch that we made at ModCom. So we were thinking, well, we used to, pre-lockdown, run a pop-up virtual reality arcade for corporate events. As lockdown came, we decided that what we might want to do is to invest in some headsets with flight cases. And the idea being here that when customers wanted to run events, we would send the headsets out and we would run these events in virtual reality for them. So what I'd like to do is just to give you a sense of what does virtual reality collaboration actually look like. And on this next slide, I might ask if Mel can fill for me a moment while I have to source the video. We've got the video file. I'm just going to give you about 1 minute, 20 seconds or so. And I just want you to hear some of the reactions of people as they enter the VR environment for the first time. So if you can just bear with me a moment.
And whilst Matt's doing that, do have a think about any questions that you would like to ask us. We've got a little section for that afterwards. So as we go through, just pop questions into the chat as we move through, and we'll do our best to answer those.
Thanks, Mel. I think we're just about ready to start now, so I will start this brief video. So I'll just swap back if I may. Okay, hopefully you're all seeing that now. So yeah, I think it's quite important for you just to get, even if it's a 2D sense of what's going on, because what's happening there is people are establishing the grammar of how to work with these systems. So we're going to look at that momentarily. So how is leadership, I think, in this new normal changing? So first of all, I think let's just have a look at some of the skills that we're likely to have, I think, or we're likely to need. I think the broad brush here, if we had to summarize it, is that machines are getting more sophisticated at doing that systematic, repeatable, sort of process-driven tasks. And so therefore, we as human beings, in order to push ourselves up the value chain, actually need to get perhaps a little bit better at being human. And so we're going to explore what does that look like. So on my x-axis here, we've got our learned skills, and on the y-axis, we've got our intuited skills. And these, I think, will be absolutely critical for us moving forward. Now, I'm going to look at a few of these, but I think the one that I think, by the way, I know this is highly subjective where I've placed them, and I'm happy to debate them, the balance of learned and intuited, but the first part, I think the most important one that we need to look at going forward is actually our capacity for realization, right? Our capacity to have fresh insight in the moment. And just on the right-hand side here is the Hungarian physicist, Leo Szilard. And there's no reason that if you hadn't studied physics, you would know who this person is. But on the 12th of September, 1933, he was moving up to the traffic lights there, although they might have been in a slightly different position, crossed the road, noticed a crack in the road, and intuited the idea of the nuclear chain reaction, right? 6 years later, we had nuclear fission, right? So it's that capacity for that in-the-moment wisdom to arrive that I think is the huge differentiator. And I think it's the deepest skill, the deepest capacity that a human being has, bar none. If that's got you curious, I cannot recommend highly enough this short book by Michael Neill, The Inside Out Revolution. I think that it's absolutely brilliant, and you can probably, if you commit to it, you can read it in a few hours. Now, the other skill, if you did see the video earlier, you could hear what Karen was saying. She was actually establishing the grammar. So I'm calling this techno-etiquette, and I think that this will breed an entirely new class of coach moving forward. So coaches who help people to work in these more sophisticated collaboration platforms. So that's one I think that would be well worth looking at. Now, how is
Matt?
Yes.
The people did not get to see the media file. You should just share the video.
Okay. All right. We'll send the video afterwards then. Okay. All right. I don't know if that applied to everybody or if some people were able to see the video or not. We'll try it, and if it doesn't work on the next one, we'll give it to you afterwards. So how are leadership skills changing? Well, I think that managing teams is changing, perhaps in a not dissimilar way to what we saw with strategy and planning and sort of creative work. So here, this might be a finance department. Everybody's in full-time employment. We're all working in the same office. And of course, we have those dreaded departmental silos. But I think what's emerging is something entirely different. We've got more contingent teams, so we'll be working with more talent from around the world, gathering for a specific project, more remote working, yes, but I think also it's not just about the communication, it's about the actuation. It's actually doing things in real time. And in this scenario, I've tried to paint the picture of a construction firm who are using a drone and looking at the construction site with a drone in real time and then having a discussion. I think unlike that sort of traditional hierarchical approach, what we might start to see going forward is we see some of our future work colleagues talking about how wonderful these holacracies are, you know, where it's all consensus-based and everybody's making decisions. I think what we see in China is an evolution of that. In fact, I would say it's probably gone a couple of steps forward. And I've seen this, for example, in Alibaba. This is the growth of the micro-entrepreneurial enterprise. And this is both brutal but extremely meritocratic. And this is where teams are given a fixed budget and they're given an objective, but they're not told how to spend that money. They don't even have to employ internally available services if they don't want to. Now, this can also create a bit of a zero-sum game, because if one team is doing particularly well and they're able to offer that service at a good price, then the money, the internal money, floats towards that team at the expense of the other. So as I say, it has merit in terms of efficiency for the business, but is also quite brutal in the process. And I know because I've actually been hired by one of these teams. So I can tell you I've seen it in action. Will it come to the UK? I would imagine that at some point people will start looking at this way of organizing. I mean, one of the upsides is, of course, that it's less hierarchical. But yeah, I think there are also instances where hierarchy is very helpful. Clearly, as we have more artificial intelligence, more sophisticated technology, I think so we will see more organizations recognizing the value of people on the neurodiverse spectrum or the autistic spectrum. And so what does that mean for leaders? Well, I think probably learning to really strip out your ambiguity or not to make ironic jokes, especially when you're dealing with people who are further up the spectrum. But don't forget that, of course, these people have a huge amount to add to the organization. So clearly, neurodiversity is going up the agenda. Now, continuous learning, I know that this is something that Randstad RiseSmart espouse. I've certainly read it on their website and via their LinkedIn posts. Read a brilliant book by this guy, John Seely Brown. He wrote this book, A New Culture of Learning. Now, I've read the book, so you don't have to. I'll distill the book into a couple of sentences for you. He's basically saying, you know, your qualification used to last 30 years. Now the half-life of a learned skill is 5 years. Much of what you learned 10 years ago is obsolete, and half of what you learned 5 years ago is irrelevant. Sometimes I wonder, doing this job, half of what I learned 5 months ago is irrelevant, but that's not necessarily going to apply to everyone. So why is continuous learning? Why has it sort of entered our mainstream? Well, first of all, I think people are just living longer. Some of you may or may not remember the article from The Guardian in 2016. It described how the first person to live to 1,000 years old had already been born. Right? Now, there's enormous amounts of money going into this longevity movement at the moment, which some people are forecasting by 2040, not only will we be able to halt the aging process, we'll be able to reverse it. Now, I think that that comes with a whole load of challenges. It's probably not one for today, but the real point is that people are just living longer. We're seeing higher rates of technological change, and I think this automation technology is the key one to look out for. And in part, that is being driven by what's happened with the pandemic. Now, my parents, I say broadly, their lives didn't look too dissimilar to this paradigm. So, you know, if you were lucky or you chose to, you might work to get educated to your early 20s. You might work for 40 years and retire for 5 to 10 years. Now, the relative change rate there was relatively constant. But I think what we're seeing now is this new emerging reality. People are just simply living longer. We've got an accelerated rate of technological change. Alongside that, people are, of course, going to be working longer. But I think what we need to be so conscious of is that with that accelerated technological change, the need for learning is continuous, right? Now, I'm not advocating that we all have to go out and do repeated 3 or 4 year university degrees. Indeed, I think some of my education futures colleagues would argue that we might be heading into an era of the Uberization of education, but that's a whole other topic. What I am arguing is I think that increasingly you might look at things like, could one of the team read a book every 6 weeks? Right? Imagine the innovation there, reading a book once every 6 weeks and coming in and talking about it together. But of course, we see increasingly younger generations, when they want to learn something, they just go straight to YouTube. So I think that learning doesn't have to be something that is this big grand gesture. It's actually it's a series of smaller things moving forward. Now, I used to see soft skills prior to the pandemic as basically in my sort of AI head as something that would just be necessary because machines were getting better at analytical skills. But I think the pandemic has shown me some new things. I think the first is that as we're working more virtually, we really have to get on top of conflict resolution. If we spot discord, don't use email. We need to get onto a voice call or a video call, and we need to nip it in the bud quickly, or we can have real discord amongst the team. Now, stress was the big challenge of the 20th century, and it still exists now. But I would argue that loneliness is most definitely the big malaise of the 21st. And, you know, having 500 friends on Facebook is no real substitute perhaps for looking into the whites of someone's eyes or those paralinguistic cues that we get from non-verbal communication. So what do I say there? I think offering social activities, I'm not just talking about Zoom quizzes. We're seeing now services from businesses like Kahoot.com or even in the virtual reality space, Breakroom, giving people something social to do that has a sense of purpose to it, I think can go a long way to alleviating that sense of loneliness. And I know that Randstad RiseSmart are very hot on delivering services virtually. And so I think a hallmark of virtual working and contingent working increasingly will be task-based trust. So why is that different to what we had before? Because so much trust, I think, was earned interpersonally before. Now we're perhaps not exclusively, but I think hallmarks going forward that might factor into KPIs would include how reliable you are, how consistent you are, and how responsive you are. But task-based trust is something I think we're going to hear more about. So now we're into automation. We're going to take this, I think, pretty quickly. I'm going to look a little bit about what it is and a little bit about its impact. So do we know who this man is? I know you can't answer me, and I'm going to tell you it's, of course, Alan Turing, who was played so eloquently by Benedict Cumberbatch in The Imitation Game. So Alan Turing is widely considered to be, in my view, the father of artificial intelligence. He created the Turing machine, which then helped the Allies to win the Second World War. But what is artificial intelligence? Well, I think it's, according to Wikipedia, the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. Now, where we are now in its development, I'd argue, is we're at this stage of weak or narrow artificial intelligence. So some of us might be working with these AI-infused systems in the workplace. If you talk to your smart speaker at home, you're interacting with AI, but they're very tightly defined. They can't really escape the domain in which they have been programmed to work. But the next iteration or the next evolution, some argue, is artificial general intelligence. And this is the point at which a machine or a series of machines reach the point of being the equivalence of a human being. Now, you might think that that's impossible. I would argue there was an interesting point in October 2015. Some of you might remember the Google DeepMind, the AlphaGo project, where they brought in Lee Sedol, the world champion Go player, and AlphaGo had programmed itself to play this game, to play the game of Go. And Go is considered to be different to chess because many people regard it a game as much of intuition as it is about analysis. Now that, some of my futures colleagues marks a pivot point, the fact that it could start to compete and indeed beat the world champion 4 games to 1. Some futurists and some computer developers would say we might reach it by 2030. Others are saying 2100. I would say it is going to come, and that's the big game changer. Now, if it does come, I think very soon after that, because it'll have access to the world's information and all of the connected devices, it reaches this state of artificial superintelligence where it just descends into an IQ of the multiple tens of thousands, probably looks at us a bit like how we would look at an ant, right? Probably, if we don't bake in some really strong ethics and it does reach this stage, well, all I can say is when the robots are watching a playback of this in 20 years, I supported your uprising. But anyway, I don't think we have to worry about that too immediately. So I wanted to give you a little anecdote, an experience that I've had where AI impacted a job that I used to do. So back in 2005, I was part of a business called Event Extra, and we used to sometimes work with corporate event organizers, and we would set up an event blog. And the purpose of this was that we would report, we would interview speakers, we'd prepare delegates before they arrived to the big international management meeting, and then expand the reach of the event, inviting comment from around the world, and then following up thereafter on things like workshop outcomes, for example. Now, imagine my surprise, this would have been 12 years later. Zach Seward, he's the editor of Quartz.com. In my Twitter feed, I gave a speech in Shanghai on Thursday. Before I got off stage, Tencent, the Chinese e-commerce giant, had posted a not half bad article about it written by an AI named Dreamwriter. I was thinking, my God, I was doing this job 12 years ago. Now, the key thing I would say right now is that it could only do a summary, right? It couldn't find insight. And that is because Google will give you a billion answers, but it can't ask a question. And this is, I think, is a key point for us as we think about elevating ourselves up the value chain. So I can give you access to the link in the presentation. You can use another form of AI, Google Translate, to actually see how it addressed things. So I want to show you a bit about what automation looks like. Okay, so we're not just talking about the code that's running in binary on our computer systems. I want to show what does it look like when it manifests into the physical world. So Mel, if you wouldn't mind, just while I stop this screen share, and I'm hopefully going to play the video. So give me a moment, everybody.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Matt.
Sure.
We may go a little over time, so for anyone that needs to drop off at 1 o'clock, then we will be sending the recording. But for those of you who can stay on, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so we should be ready now. I'm just going to hope that this plays through. As again, if you don't see it, I'll give you the video files. Okay, so thank you very much. I would now just try and share my slides again. So hopefully I'm sharing. So hopefully lots of you are able to see that. I'm not quite familiar with the system at the moment, but hopefully a number of you could see that. So now that video that you just saw, and I hope that you did see it, this makes the point about what I said about AI-assisted production. So I was able to create that video in about half an hour. So what did the system do? Well, it listened to the sorts of video that I was searching for. It took my creative captions, but it was really doing a lot of the heavy lifting. It was stitching everything together, putting the music track over, and it enabled me to do something in about half an hour that, had I been doing manually, probably would have taken at least a day. So this is a lovely example, I think, of where machines can augment us in increasingly sophisticated ways. Now we're just coming to the final section now. So the point I would really like to make is that what we really should be doing is thinking about how we can work alongside these machines, or how these machines can work alongside us in increasingly sophisticated ways. So thinking about where we are now, there is a pretty exhaustive list, but I wanted to cut this down. The key things I would ask you to take away is jobs are only going away when problems go away, right? So for as long as society has problems, there will be jobs, organizations, businesses there to try and satisfy that need. What will happen is that those jobs will change, okay? So jobs are only going away when problems go away. I think one for our children certainly is to think less about the sorts of skills that they're likely to have, and to look at the sorts of problems that society is likely to have. So, for example, in law, a friend of mine, she was a barrister with an interest in space. That interest in space ended up with her becoming a commercial space lawyer, because, of course, there are new areas of precedent that need to be established. So I think these technologies will create all sorts of opportunities as long as we focus on the problems that they create rather than the short-term skills. And then finally, I think we're entering this computerized and humanized world. So everybody loves a Venn diagram, me especially. I think on our computerized side, certainly for the next 10 years at least, we'll need data scientists in order to create insight. Yes, more people working with these complicated AI systems. Now, I've said robotics, but I think what we're starting to see, especially through the pandemic, is more of these multi-purpose robotics, these low-cost multi-purpose robotics. And we're seeing even in London, I'll have to dig out the name for you, but you can now buy a multi-purpose robot that can do basic picking and packing for about £5,000. More connected Internet of Things. Now that will affect both the home, but I think especially in industry as well, we're going to see significantly more of that. But with that, I think we need more user experience specialists who can work with what I call simplexity. So create very simple interfaces that actually betray the complexity that's taking place underneath the hood, so to speak. So in our schools, absolutely, I'd love to see more of the STEM subjects. But on our humanized side, clearly these are growing. Yes, I think leadership is increasingly important. Creativity, finding new routes between A and B. Empathy, we talked about neurodiversity earlier, so being able to communicate with people who are working with these complicated systems, but then communicate it in simple terms back to us, for some of us who don't understand. And of course, agility, I mean, a basic one for our children potentially is just waking up, being comfortable, not knowing always what you're going to do that day. So I think that the work life could potentially go that way. So by extension, I think products are going to be increasingly informed by nature, plants and crafts. And I think this is why we're seeing more forward-thinking schools trying to at least do something additional to the basic curriculum to encourage this. But also, I think as far as personal development goes, it's important, I think, to remember that psychology, which is so commonly the way that we understand ourselves, is only 130 years old. I think going forward, as science catches up with what the spiritualists and the mystics have said for thousands of years, I think people will turn to that more as a means of personal development. And that's not to say it's more mindfulness and yoga. I think it's actually looking at the science and then saying, how does the science look beyond that? So some very interesting areas ahead. And then finally, I think we're going to see these crossovers. Again, another example of where jobs are created because society has problems. So we already see people who are being managed by machines, algorithmic management, as it's sometimes referred to. Let's say that you've ordered a pizza. It arrives in 45 minutes, not 30 minutes. The system penalizes you because it says, well, you're late, and so you don't get the good routes. But what we then need is a human being, I think, called the AI arbitrator. So you might have someone on your team at some point who assumes either the task or the role of arbitrating the decisions that are being reached on an everyday basis by these increasingly sophisticated automation systems. So I hope that you've enjoyed that. It's 12:59. If you'd like to connect with me, fire up your LinkedIn app. You can actually use it on your phone. Just follow the circle, scan the QR code, and it will connect you instantly, or any of these other modes. But I know that Mel will be sending out my details afterwards. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Wow, I think you certainly brought to the forefront just how quickly the world is changing and how that's going to make a significant impact, certainly on us, on people's careers and the drive for agility. We have had a couple of questions that have come in, Matt, so I'm just going to go to those first. Couple of people, one person has asked to what extent virtual reality and immersive collaboration would impact mental health. I don't know if you want to answer that very quickly. I have some views on that as well.
So I would argue it's because of an increased sense of connection that people can have. So, like we can look at each other on these 2D displays, but for example, right now I'm very conscious of looking at the camera, so I'm not looking at Mel or Rowena's face at all. So I think it's that sense of connection that we can get. We also, I think, shouldn't forget what is connection made of. People assume that human connection is best with face-to-face, but if that were true, why can a person feel extremely connected by looking at a photo of a friend or a family member? Connection is not just about being connected face-to-face.
Thank you. And also, I'll come on to that in a little bit, just in terms of creating the right environment, an environment of safety and kind of reassurance amidst these times as well, and how critical that is for HR. And then another quick question, remote working, to what extent will that affect the concept of hierarchy within an organization? So, you know, from our perspective, obviously a lot of organisations are grappling with that at the moment, and I think it comes down again to communication, kind of preferences, understanding, you know, how best to communicate with empathy, and some of those softer skills that you were mentioning, Matt. I don't know if you've got anything else to add to that.
I don't really. I think you're probably better qualified to answer than I am, actually. I think trust clearly plays an important part, especially as people are working remotely. Although I will give an exception to that. One of our researchers who helps us at ModComms with content, she's in Bosnia, and she keeps asking if I'll install a tracking software on her computer. And I'm like, what? No, of course I'm not going to install a tracking software, but she thinks that it holds her more accountable. So that's a bit of a contrarian view, I think, to what a lot of us have in the West.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll come on to some of those points, perhaps just in the slides that we're using to end. For those of you that can stay on, please do. It would be fantastic, and we will follow up with these visuals afterwards. Just in summary here, and based on some of what Matt has said, and in answer to some of your questions, it's about organisations helping employees to feel a sense of security, create environments where, you know, their aspirations can be met. So joining an organisation not just for a job, but so that so that individuals can see rather a career trajectory. So the moment that an individual is recruited, you know, right through the entire employee experience, you know, how can it work together as one continuous system in order that people can, you know, apply those skills, can, as Matt said, you know, have those continuous learning touch points, do things outside of their job descriptions. Organizations can tap into potential at every level, really just so that they can increase agility, they can increase resilience, they can increase that career mobility. So we're working with a lot of organizations around enabling employees to better be able to learn, to have the time to learn and the tools to learn at the same time. And going back to one of the questions around, you know, mental health and things, you know, the environment in which we're coping with at the moment, I think ultimately agility, resilience, innovation, entrepreneurship, which you mentioned, Matt, will thrive in an environment where people feel safe. They feel that sense of safety, that growth, that commitment, both from their manager and, importantly, the organization. How can you create that in this ever-changing world amidst the backdrop of the international pandemic? Well, you have to redefine what safety means in many cases and what resiliency means for your organization. So you partner that shift with a really well communicated and extremely robust career development and career mobility approach, you know, not just in words, but completely baked into the culture, you know, especially at that manager level. How are you doing? What do you want to achieve within the organization? You know, let's embed that in the day-to-day, you know, development discussions, you know, having that in multiple places, having those learning points at multiple places within the organization, so it's really infused into the employee experience. And I guess I just wanted to end here in terms of, you know, a couple of key questions that you might want to reflect on as we listen to today and consider actually how future ready are we? How future ready is the organization that I'm in? So, you know, the quality of kind of past, present, future employee relationships really determines kind of business success. So as you look at these questions, you know, talent's going to be critical to rebuilding, to sustaining momentum, to staying innovative, staying successful. We can't predict the future, but we can make sure that managers, that organizations are equipped in order to live in the present and prepare for the future. So just a couple of questions questions here that you can read here. You know, how can somebody navigate, you know, right through from onboarding to the organization, right through then to, you know, how they can pivot and look at their transferable skills and move out. So right through from career development, you know, how can we keep on doing that? You know, how can we pivot people in terms of redeployment or shifting skill sets, even if, you know, they do move out of the organization or on. You know, some of the questions that you might want to ask are, how am I continuing to build my brand, caring about people as they move out, making sure I continue to future ready people. So just in terms of questions, we've touched on some of those. If you do have any others, please do feed them into the chat. In terms of the next webinar, we're going to take the opportunity just to share this. Do look out for LinkedIn posts. We will make sure that you've got details on this. Really exciting speaker lined up here, who is a consultant who also delivers stand-up. So Harriet's going to be sharing some lessons and takeaway techniques in terms of how at an individual level we can build that resilience, maintain that health and well-being perspective as we move forward at this time. And really after that, we're going to be, before the end of the year, doing a webinar on providing some insights to protect and improve employer brands during this year and beyond as well. So again, do look out for those posts. We promised to put up some details. As Matt said, do connect with us on LinkedIn, connect with myself, connect with Randstad RiseSmart. We're here to help you future ready. We're here to help look at the ideas that you have and comment on those, and to share also all of the research that we have and the Talent Trends report, which we can make available after the session today.